If you'd told me 7 years ago that I'd be sitting in a dimly lit room, pouring my heart out about the ruins of my marriage to a group of strangers, I would have laughed it off. Back then, I thought I had everything figured out: a devoted wife, a bright-eyed little boy who called me daddy, and a house straight out of a picturesque holiday catalog. Life seemed perfect, or at least that's what I told myself. Emily and I met at university. She wasn't just beautiful, she was captivating. Sharp, witty, and had this infectious laugh that could light up the entire room. She had this habit of tucking her hair behind her ear whenever she smiled, and, for some reason, it always left me speechless. I fell for her quickly, like a fool who didn't even think to slow down. For a while I believed she'd fallen for me just as hard. We tied the knot not long after graduation. It wasn't an extravagant affair, just our closest friends, family, and plenty of sparkling wine that tasted far better than its price tag suggested. But in that moment, surrounded by people we loved, it felt like nothing else mattered. It felt perfect. Then came our son, Daniel, and suddenly, my world expanded in ways I couldn't have imagined. He was my sidekick, my little adventurer. Whether we were building blanket forts or chasing fireflies in the backyard, I couldn't picture life getting any better than it was. But life has a cruel way of reminding you that nothing stays perfect forever. Just when you think you've got everything under control, it yanks the floor right out from under you. The cracks in our idyllic life began to show the day Emily told me she was pregnant again. At first, I was over the moon. Another child? A sibling? For Daniel? I was ecstatic, but now, looking back, I can see it clearly. That hesitation in her voice, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Something wasn't right, but I brushed it off at the time. After all, she was pregnant. Who wouldn't feel a little overwhelmed? Then the little things started piling up. Late nights at work that became more frequent. Muted phone calls she claimed were with her sister. A newfound obsession with keeping her phone locked at all times. I told myself I was imagining things. Emily wasn't capable of betrayal. She wasn't that kind of person. Or so I thought. I've never been the jealous type, never had a reason to be. But even I couldn't ignore how much she'd changed. She seemed distant, preoccupied, and surprisingly clumsy at hiding it. One evening she told me she had a work dinner. I didn't think much of it until I decided to check her location on my phone. She wasn't at the restaurant she mentioned. Instead, her car was parked in front of some unfamiliar house on the other side of town. When she came home, I acted as if nothing was wrong. "How was the dinner?" I asked, keeping my tone light. For a split second she froze, a hesitation so brief that most people would have missed it. "Oh, it was fine," she said, her voice calm but hurried. She brushed past me, dropping her purse on the counter. "It ran late, though. I'm exhausted." Something was off. I knew it deep down. But instead of confronting her, I stayed silent, unsure of what to do next. Not yet. I wasn't ready to accuse her outright. What if I was wrong? What if this paranoia was all in my head? How could I risk destroying my family over what might just be a misunderstanding? A week later, while organizing the chaos in the kitchen's junk drawer, I stumbled upon something that made my heart skip a beat. It was an old photograph of Emily sitting next to a man I didn't recognize. They weren't just smiling. There was an intimacy in their posture that struck me immediately. Too close, too familiar. When I showed it to her, she let out a casual laugh. "Oh, that's just Matt," she said with a dismissive wave. "We dated briefly back in university. It was nothing serious." "Nothing serious?" I asked, holding up the photo. "You're practically in his lap." She rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed. "Logan, that was over a decade ago. It means nothing. Just drop it." So I dropped it, or at least pretended to. But the image stayed with me, nagging at the edges of my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. And the doubt, that took root, growing deeper with every passing day. The breaking point came months later. Daniel had caught a cold, not a big deal, just a standard virus that had him running a mild fever. We took him to his pediatrician for a checkup, and while explaining test results, the doctor casually mentioned his blood type, AB. At first, the comment didn't register. But as we drove home, the words kept echoing in my head. I don't know much about genetics, but I know you can't get an AB child from an O blood father and an A blood mother. That's basic biology. Are you certain? I had asked the doctor at the time, my voice deceptively calm. Absolutely, she replied, oblivious to the wrecking ball she had just swung through my life. The drive back was surreal. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, and the world outside blurred into insignificance. I couldn't shake the numbers, the impossibility of it all. When we got home, I couldn't contain it any longer. "Emily," I said firmly, trapping her in the kitchen, "we need to talk." She looked up from her phone, startled by the edge in my voice. "What's going on?" she asked cautiously. "What's Daniel's blood type?" I demanded. Her face drained of color. I don't remember," she stammered. "It's AB," I said, the words cutting through the air like a knife. "And you're A. So tell me, Emily, how is that possible?" Her mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time in all our years together, Emily was utterly silent. And in that silence, I had my answer. Her face was ghostly pale, her hands gripping the edge of the counter for support, as if the truth itself might knock her off her feet. I wanted her to deny it, to tell me I was wrong, to laugh at my absurdity and explain how I'd misunderstood. Instead, she just stared at me, frozen, like a deer caught in the headlights. "Emily," I said again, my voice sharp and unforgiving. "Say something." Her lips trembled as tears welled up in her eyes. I don't know what to say." I could feel my chest tighten, my heart pounding in disbelief. "You don't know what to say?" I snapped. "How about the truth? How about telling me whose child I've been raising for the past 5 years? "Logan, stop," she whispered, her voice cracking as tears began streaming down her face. "It's not what you think," Emily stammered, her voice trembling as she tried to bridge the gap between us. I let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "Oh, it's exactly what I think." I stared at her, my voice cold and sharp. "You cheated on me, didn't you? You've been lying to me for years, and now the truth is out." She took a tentative step toward me, her eyes pleading, but I raised my hand to stop her. Don't even think about trying to hug me right now," I snapped. For a brief moment it looked like she might confess, that she'd finally own up to the truth, but instead she slipped into her usual tactic, damage control. "Logan, it was a mistake," she said, her voice breaking, tears threatening to spill. "It happened once. I swear it didn't mean anything." A nauseating wave churned in my stomach. "Once," I repeated, my tone dripping with disbelief. "You're telling me it happened once, and somehow we ended up with Daniel? Do you think I'm that stupid, Emily?" Her composure shattered as she broke down into sobs. "I didn't know how to tell you," she whispered through her tears. I thought it didn't matter. You love him. He loves you. You're his dad." Her words hit me like a hammer to the chest. I did love Daniel. He was my boy, the same little boy who used to fall asleep on my chest as a baby, who proudly called me Dada before he even learned to say Mama. But now every cherished memory felt like a cruel lie. "I'm not his dad," I said, my voice as cold as ice. "His real dad is out there somewhere, and you, what? You decided I'd make a convenient replacement? You let me play this role because it was easier for you?" She flinched at my words as if I'd slapped her, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to tiptoe around her feelings anymore. The trust we once had was gone, shattered into pieces I couldn't put back together. Even after her tearful confession about Daniel, doubts about the new baby gnawed at me. "Sure," she cried, begged for forgiveness, and swore that the baby was mine. But how could I believe her now? Every word she said felt rehearsed, like another lie carefully constructed to placate me. One suffocating afternoon, as we sat in the living room, the silence between us heavier than lead, I finally broke it. "I need to know for sure," I said, my tone calm but unwavering. Emily looked up sharply, her eyes already glassy with unshed tears. "Logan, no. You don't need a test. You are his father. You've always been his father." "Am I?" I shot back, leaning forward. My voice, though steady, carried the weight of my anger and betrayal. "Because last time we talked about this, you admitted Daniel wasn't mine. You called it a mistake. So tell me, Emily, how am I supposed to believe you now?" "That's not what I meant," she cried, her voice cracking under the pressure. "I only said that because you were pushing me. I was overwhelmed. I didn't mean it." I scoffed, the anger rising like a tide I couldn't hold back. "Don't you dare put this on me," I said through gritted teeth. "So now you're telling me you just made it up? That you lied about the biggest betrayal of our marriage because you were feeling stressed?" She sobbed harder now, her whole body shaking. "I wasn't thinking straight," she whispered, clutching her hands to her chest. "You have to believe me, Logan. Daniel is yours. The baby is yours." Her words hung in the air, desperate and raw. But for me, they only deepened the cracks in what was left of our life together. "They're both yours," Emily said, her voice breaking as she tried to hold herself together. But her words carried no weight with me anymore. I could see the truth in her expression, the nervous flicker in her eyes, the way her hands fidgeted at her sides, and her refusal to meet my gaze. It was all too familiar. For years I'd been caught in her web of half-truths and careful lies. Not this time. Without a word, I rose to my feet, walked over to Daniel, and scooped him up into my arms. "Where are you going?" Emily's voice quivered, her panic clear as she followed me. "We're getting answers," I said firmly, grabbing my car keys from the counter. "Logan, stop, please," she cried, trailing after me as I headed for the door. "You don't need to do this. You're overthinking everything." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. I strapped Daniel into his car seat and shut the door, her voice muffled as she begged me to listen. I didn't. My phone buzzed incessantly as I drove to the nearest DNA testing clinic, her name lighting up the screen over and over again. I ignored every call, my jaw clenched so tight it hurt. 2 agonizing weeks later, the results were ready. I sat alone in my car outside the lab, the envelope clutched in my hands. It felt impossibly heavy, like it contained the weight of my entire world. My palms were clammy, and my chest was tight, my heart thundering as I stared at the sealed flap. Finally, I tore it open, scanning the results with trembling hands. Probability of paternity, 0%. Even though I had prepared myself for this, the words on the page hit like a punch to the gut. Seeing it written in black and white made it real. My mind blanked, my body numb, as I sat there staring at the damning paper. When I finally walked through the front door at home, Emily was already waiting for me in the living room. She sprang to her feet the moment she saw me, her face a mix of dread and fragile hope. "Well?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't respond. Instead, I pulled the crumpled results from my jacket pocket and tossed them onto the coffee table. The papers fluttered to a stop, the bold text glaring up at her like an accusation. Emily froze, her eyes scanning the page. Her face turned pale as tears began streaming down her cheeks. "Logan, I can explain," she started, her voice breaking, but I cut her off before she could continue. "No, you can't," I said, my tone cold and final. "There's nothing left to explain." She stared at the paper as though sheer willpower could rewrite the results. Her mouth opened, but no words came out, just a choked sob. Slowly, she sank onto the couch, clutching the paper in her trembling hands. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice shaking. "How could this happen? Logan, I swear, I don't even remember. I don't know how." "Stop," I said sharply, cutting through her excuses like a knife. "Just stop, Emily. I'm done listening to your lies." She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, desperation etched in every line. "I'm not lying," she pleaded. "I made a mistake, yes, but I don't even remember when or how. I don't know." Her words trailed off, and for the first time she seemed as lost as I felt. "You have to believe me, Logan," Emily sobbed, her voice cracking under the weight of her desperation. "I never wanted this to happen." "You don't know? You can't remember?" I said, my voice rising with every word. "Emily, you betrayed me, lied to me for years, and now you're sitting here acting like you don't even know who it was with. That's unbelievable, truly unbelievable." Her sobs grew louder, her hands clutching at her hair, as if she were trying to hold herself together. "Logan, please," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "You have to understand. Daniel is our son. He might not be your blood, but in every way that matters, you're his dad." I raised a hand sharply to cut her off. "Don't," I said, my tone razor sharp. "Don't even mention the baby to me. Because right now, I don't believe that child is mine either." She gasped, her sobs turning into shallow breaths as she struggled to compose herself. "No, Logan," she said, shaking her head frantically. "The baby is yours. I swear to you, it's yours." "Really?" I shot back, sarcasm dripping from every word. "The same way you swore Daniel was mine? Forgive me if I'm not exactly inclined to believe you, Emily." She stood abruptly, her movements frantic and disjointed. "Logan, this is different. There hasn't been anyone else, I promise you." I let out a bitter laugh, the sound devoid of any humor. "That's exactly what you said about Daniel, and look how that turned out." "I'm telling the truth this time," she pleaded, her voice cracking under the strain. "Please, Logan, you have to believe me." But I didn't. I couldn't. I stared at her, my voice calm and cutting. "No, Emily, the only thing I believe is that I can't trust you. Not anymore. Not ever again." Her face crumpled, but I didn't let her speak. I pressed on, my tone unwavering. "I'm going to have a DNA test done for this baby, too," I said firmly. "And before you even start, yes, I know I'll have to wait until it's born. Fine, I'll wait. But let me make one thing perfectly clear. My name isn't going on that birth certificate until I have proof. If the test says the baby is mine, we'll talk. Until then, the answer is no." Emily looked as if I'd physically struck her. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm completely serious," I said, crossing my arms as I leaned against the doorframe. "And just so we're on the same page, I'll be calling a lawyer first thing tomorrow morning. I need to protect myself from whatever fallout this turns into. If you think I'm going to let you, or anyone else, drag me through the mud, you've got another thing coming." That's when she snapped. Her tears morphed into full-blown hysteria, her cries turning into guttural, gasping sobs. She started pacing the room, pulling at her hair, muttering incoherently between breaths. Then she turned to me, her eyes wild and filled with desperation. "Logan, you can't do this!" she screamed, her voice shaking the walls. "You're tearing this family apart." "This family?" I repeated coldly. "What family, Emily?" "You destroyed that the moment you decided to betray me." She froze for a moment, her lips trembling as she whispered, "What about Daniel? What about the baby? What about us?" I stared at her, my voice as cold as ice. "There is no us, Emily, not anymore." Her face twisted with panic, her tears flowing freely as the reality of my words sank in. "Please, Logan, I'll do anything, anything," Emily sobbed, her voice cracking under the weight of her desperation. "Just don't do this." I shook my head slowly, the cold finality of my decision sinking in. "The time for anything was years ago, Emily. You made your choices, and now I'm making mine." She collapsed onto the couch, her body racked with uncontrollable sobs. For a moment I just stood there, watching the woman I once thought I knew unravel right in front of me. A small part of me wanted to feel pity for her, but I couldn't, not anymore. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, her cries following me like the fading notes of a song I never wanted to hear again. The lawyer's office wasn't what I expected. I'd imagined something sleek and intimidating, like the ones you see in movies. Polished wood desks, leather chairs, and a commanding presence. Instead, the room was modest, with worn bookshelves, a few framed diplomas, and a desk that looked like it had weathered decades of battles, just like mine. Peter Marshall, the man behind the desk, looked to be in his mid-50s, with tired eyes that hinted at a career spent untangling other people's messes. After I finished explaining my situation, he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he processed everything I'd told him. "Let me make sure I've got this right," he said. "Your wife, Emily, admitted that your first child, Daniel, isn't biologically yours, and now you're questioning the paternity of her second pregnancy, correct?" "That's right," I replied, frustration thick in my voice. "I've already done a DNA test for Daniel. It's confirmed I'm not his father. But now Emily's claiming this new baby is mine, and honestly, I don't believe a word she says." Peter nodded, his expression unreadable. "Unfortunately, Logan, the legal situation is more complicated than the facts." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He let out a small sigh, leaning forward on the desk. "Let's start with Daniel. In this state, if you were married when the child was born, the law presumes you're the legal father regardless of biology. And since you've acted as his father for the past 5 years, providing for him, raising him, establishing a parental relationship, you're considered his legal parent. From a legal standpoint, you're on the hook. I felt my stomach drop like a lead weight. You're telling me I'm stuck paying child support for a kid who isn't even mine? Peter nodded slowly. I'm afraid so. Now, we can argue for reduced child support based on your financial situation, but getting out of it entirely? That's nearly impossible. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my hands over my face. This is insane. She cheats, lies, and I'm the one who gets punished? Peter sighed, his tone sympathetic. I know it feels unfair, and frankly, it is, but this is the legal system we're working with. And the baby? I asked, clinging to the faint hope that I might have some control left. Peter paused, choosing his words carefully. With the baby, you have a better chance. We can file a motion now to establish your doubts about paternity. That way, when the child is born, there will already be a record of your concerns. This could prevent you from being automatically listed as the legal father on the birth certificate. After the baby is born, we'd request a DNA test. If it proves you're not the father, you wouldn't have any financial or legal responsibility. I nodded, my mind racing. And if the test shows I am the father? Peter shrugged slightly. Then you'd be responsible, legally and financially. But at least we'd have clarity. For now, the goal is to protect you from being tied to this child if it isn't yours. I exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. So, to recap, I'm screwed when it comes to Daniel, but I might have a fighting chance with the baby. Pretty much, Peter said with a grim smile. But even with Daniel, we'll fight for the lowest possible child support. You don't have to accept the first number they throw at you. I stared at the stack of papers on his desk, the reality of my situation sinking in. This wasn't what I wanted. Hell, it wasn't even remotely fair, but what choice did I have? Emily had backed me into a corner, and now I had to claw my way out. Start the process, I said finally. File whatever you need to file. Let's get this thing moving. Peter gave a firm nod. All right, I'll handle the paperwork. But just so you know, Logan, this is going to be a long, probably ugly process. Are you ready for that? I stood up, the resolve hardening in my chest. Do I have a choice? Let's get it over with. As I left his office, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just signed up for a battle I wasn't sure I could win. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going down without a fight. Living with Emily after everything came out was like walking on a bed of nails. Every day was a balancing act between keeping the peace and holding on to my sanity. I couldn't leave. Not yet. Peter had warned me that abandoning her completely could backfire in court. So I stayed, paid the bills, endured the unbearable. Emily, for her part, acted like nothing had happened. Some mornings, she'd sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, flipping through baby name books like we were still a happily married couple planning for the future. Other days, she'd break down completely, sobbing uncontrollably and swearing up and down that both Daniel and the baby were mine. "You're being paranoid, Logan," she'd say, her voice trembling with desperation. "Daniel is your son. The baby is yours. You're letting all this legal nonsense mess with your head." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But every time I looked at Daniel, all I could see were the DNA results. And every time Emily brought up the baby, I felt my trust slipping further and further away. Some days the tension was unbearable. I'd pack a bag, tell her I needed space, and leave. Sometimes I crashed at a friend's house. Other nights, I'd check into a cheap motel and stare at the stained ceiling, wondering how my life had spiraled so far out of control. The silence was a temporary relief, but it never lasted long. Inevitably, my phone would start buzzing, calls and texts from Emily begging me to come home. After weeks of letting anger and doubt stew inside me, I decided to confront her again. I couldn't keep letting her avoid the truth. "Who's Daniel's father, Emily?" I asked, my voice steady but unyielding. "And don't you dare give me that 'I don't know' nonsense. I deserve the truth." She glanced up from the tea mug cradled in her hands, her eyes wide and defensive. "I've told you already, Logan. I don't remember. It was a mistake. I wasn't thinking clearly. I leaned forward, frustration building in my chest. You don't remember? You don't remember sleeping with someone else and having a child? That's convenient. Her face hardened, her voice rising as she set the mug down with a clatter. I was stressed, okay? I don't even know if it was once or more than once. I just don't know. I rubbed my temples, trying to keep my anger in check. And the baby? Are you going to tell me you don't know about this one either? She stood abruptly, her hands gripping the table. The baby is yours, Logan, she shouted, tears streaming down her face. I swear to God, she's yours. How can you be so sure? I shot back, sarcasm lacing my words. You said the same thing about Daniel, and we both know how that turned out. What proof do you have this time, Emily? Her excuses became more absurd by the second. She blamed stress hormones, even claimed some bizarre pseudoscience about how a woman's body just knows who the father is. It was like arguing with a wall. Finally, I stood, my patience completely worn thin. I can't do this anymore, so I said, heading for the door. Where are you going? She cried, desperation in her voice. To clear my head, I said without looking back. Don't wait up. The months that followed felt like living in slow motion. I wasn't counting down to the baby's birth out of excitement. I just wanted the waiting to be over so I could get the DNA test and finally have answers. When the day came, it was the middle of the night. I drove Emily to the hospital, my emotions a mix of exhaustion and dread. She gave birth to a baby girl, a beautiful little thing with a head full of dark hair. I stood in the corner of the room, watching as the nurses cleaned her up. For a fleeting moment, I felt a flicker of hope, but it vanished as quickly as it came. Emily looked at me with tearful eyes, cradling the baby in her arms. Logan, she said softly, her voice full of emotion. She's ours. She's yours. I didn't respond. I simply turned and walked out of the room, pulling out my phone as I stepped into the hallway. It's time, I told Peter, my lawyer. Emily had known this was coming long before the baby was born. Peter and I had already filed a motion challenging the paternity of the unborn child and initiated divorce proceedings. Emily tried to act like it didn't bother her, walking around the house with her head held high. But I could see through her facade. Late at night, I'd hear her whispering on the phone, her voice laced with anxiety. It didn't take long to figure out that she'd hired her own lawyer, an expensive, cutthroat one who knew exactly how to play dirty. When the DNA test confirmed what I had already suspected, that I wasn't the father, it should have been the end. But it wasn't. It was only the beginning of the nightmare. The courts didn't care about betrayal or shattered trust. They cared about dividing assets, calculating child support, and deciding custody arrangements. And Emily? She had no shame in exploiting the system for everything she could get. The legal proceedings were brutal. Peter had warned me they would be, but nothing could have prepared me for the sheer absurdity of it all. Emily's lawyer wasted no time painting her as the victim, a misunderstood, vulnerable woman who had been unfairly vilified by her controlling and paranoid husband. Mr. Grant has been emotionally manipulative, her lawyer declared, gesturing toward me like I was the villain in some soap opera. Emily has endured years of baseless accusations and threats of divorce, yet she has remained dedicated to preserving their family. Baseless accusations? I nearly laughed out loud. The DNA results were clear as day, but Emily's lawyer brushed them aside like they were a minor detail. Instead, he leaned into a story of a woman who had been pushed to her emotional limits by a neglectful husband who didn't understand her needs. She's not perfect, the lawyer admitted, his tone almost apologetic. But who among us is? Emily is a devoted mother, a woman who only wants what's best for her children. Meanwhile, Emily sat at the table, nodding along like the tragic heroine in a scripted drama. When the DNA results were brought up, she shrugged them off as a string of unfortunate coincidences. I never meant to hurt Logan, she said, her voice trembling with rehearsed sincerity. I don't even know how this happened. I just want to move forward for the sake of the kids, Emily had said in court, her voice soft, almost pleading. It was maddening, but Peter had warned me to keep my composure. Let them dig their own hole, he'd said. The facts are on our side. When the rulings came in, it was a mixed bag. On one hand, the DNA test for the newborn was accepted, confirming I wasn't the father. That spared me from a lifetime of paying for a child that wasn't mine. But Alex? That was a different story. Despite the DNA results, the court ruled that I was Alex's legal father. Peter explained it came down to one key factor. For 5 years, I'd been Alex's dad in every way that mattered. I'd fed him, cared for him, taught him how to ride a bike, and tucked him in at night. Biology didn't outweigh the bond I'd built with him. "You're still his father, Logan," the judge said, her tone laced with sympathy I didn't want. "And he deserves your continued support." That word, support, took on an entirely new meaning when the financial battle began. Emily's lawyer painted her as the struggling single mother of 2 young children, one of whom had special needs. I, on the other hand, was framed as the stable, working professional with a steady income, never mind the fact that she'd dismantled my entire life. The division of assets was just as brutal. Emily walked away with the house, most of our savings, and nearly all of the possessions we'd accumulated over the years. I left with my car, my personal savings, and a mountain of frustration. But the worst blow came with the child support ruling. The court hit me with one of the highest percentages they could impose. It felt like half of every paycheck vanished into Emily's account. Money I knew she'd use to sustain the life she'd built on deceit. Peter didn't give up, though. Over the next few years, we filed motion after motion to adjust the child support payments. Each time we argued my financial strain and the excessive burden of the original ruling. Slowly, painfully, we chipped away at the amount until it was reduced to the legal minimum. It wasn't a grand victory, but it gave me some breathing room. Those were the darkest years of my life. I lost so much, my marriage, my trust, my savings, but I gained one thing, freedom, and that I realized was worth every fight. Looking back, it's hard to believe I survived it all. The legal battles, the betrayals, the financial strain. It felt like an endless storm, but life has a funny way of turning things around. After years of struggle, I started to rebuild. My finances stabilized, and I managed to grow a small business from the ground up. Sure, I'm still paying child support for Alex, but I no longer dwell on it. At the end of the day, he's still the little boy I watched grow up, even if the circumstances aren't what I'd hoped for. And then there was my love life. After the divorce, I threw myself back into dating, not because I was desperate, but because I wanted to remember what it felt like to connect with someone again. Dating in your 30s was different. Some women would ask with a raised eyebrow, "So you've been divorced?" What happened? I'd gotten pretty good at giving the short version. She cheated, I left. That's it. Not every relationship worked out. Some ended on good terms, others left me shaking my head. One woman even brought up marriage on our second date. I smiled, paid the check, and never called her again. Marriage, for me, became a trigger word, something that sent my fight-or-flight instincts into overdrive. And most of the time, it was flight. Then I met Kate. She wasn't like anyone else I'd dated. For starters, she didn't care about the divorce. This is the end of the story, so don't forget to share your opinion and experience in the comments. And also, if you like the story, subscribe to the channel. That would not miss new video.